And notice that we added the letters ms on the end. Again, this gives it a descriptive name because the delay function takes milliseconds. Now, let's talk about scope. The two variables we just declared are called global variables. That is, any part of the program can use them or access them, hence the name. You'll sometimes use these for things like pin numbers. And we can see in the sketch that both setup and loop need access to the pin number because pin mode and setup and digital write and loop both need to know the pin number. And I almost forgot. This hard-coded number with the variable name. Okay. So we did that. But anyway, what about the delay time ms variable? Now it looks here like loop is a code block that needs to know this information, and setup does not. And just to be clear, by code block we're referring to any code that's enclosed by these curly braces. So setup and loop are two distinct blocks of code. And if we write our own function, the function definition would be another code block because it's enclosed by curly braces. And we'll talk more about writing your own functions later in the course, by the way. Now back to the subject of scope. Since loop is the only block of code that needs to use a delay time ms variable, let's move it from the top of the sketch to the top of the block that contains a loop function. We'll just come over here, cut, and paste. So doing this will mean the variable is no longer global in scope. Rather, it becomes a local variable, and only functions in loop will be able to use the variable. And this is a good thing. So when possible, it's good practice to limit the scope of variables as much as possible. This can help prevent errors and having some unintended section of code accessing or altering a variable it shouldn't have access to. Now I know that sounds kind of silly when we're talking about simple programs with only a few lines of code like this, but as you learn and progress, your sketches will become longer and more complicated. So again, it's good to instill good programming habits early on, even if it seems pointless now. And not only that, but limiting variable scope when possible helps conserve precious program memory space. Now I won't go into gory detail at this point about how or why this is the case, but global variables occupy the program memory space the whole time the sketch executes, while local variables do not. They're gone from memory when the calculation, or whatever they're being used for, is done. So let's demonstrate here. If I try to use the variable in setup here, I'll get a scope error. So let me take this. So as we can see here, I have an error. And if we expand this, we can see something about delay time ms was not declared in this scope. So we'll go ahead and remove that. And we compile without any trouble. Here's another important point to remember about variables. A variable must be declared before it gets used in the program. So for example, if I take delay ms and move it to the bottom of this code block here and try to compile it, I'll get an error. So as we can see, I got kind of the same error. So putting it back on top where it was fixes this. And we see it compiled successfully. The same holds true for global variables. So if I take LED pin here and declare it like, say, between, I don't know, setup and loop here, and try to compile it, I should get an error. And I do. Or if I take it and stick it, down here after loop function, I still get an error, as we can see. But if I take that global variable and stick it back up here where it should be, our sketch compiles. So let's do a quick review before I wrap this up. Use variables rather than hard-coded numbers when possible. How often? Like 99% of the time. A variable's scope refers to where it can be used and is defined by where it's declared. So we declare this up here, it's global. When we declare this guy right here, it can only be used within this code block here, not outside. Variables can be global, which means, again, all code blocks can see them and use them, or local, which means that only the block the variable is declared in can see and use the variable, as we just demonstrated. Good practice tells us to limit variable scope when possible. And finally, a variable must be declared before it can be used. Okay, so now we know about variable scope and why using literals usually isn't a great idea. Well guys, that's really all we need to say about these things for now. I'll see you in the next lesson.